Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapters 36 and 37 in our continuing study of the Old Testament prophets. Just to give you a background on all of the book of Isaiah, it's divided into two major sections, but three for the purposes that we're looking at today. Chapters 1 through 35 are judgments that Isaiah is dealing with, mostly judgments that the people were going through in his day or shortly were going to come to pass. The section we're coming to now will be chapters 36 through 39. This is a historical interlude. And then following that, we have the second, really the second major section of the book is glory in the future. So we had that whole first section dealing with the judgment of God, and then the last section, chapters 40 through 66, the comfort of God. That makes it sort of easy to understand, to remember, not to understand, but to remember, because just as the first part of the book is 39 chapters long, remember there's 39 books in the Old Testament, there's 27 books in the New Testament, 66 books in the entire Bible, and that means that Isaiah follows the same general pattern as does the entire Bible. Judgment, if we take that for the Old Testament theme, and then comfort, the New Testament theme. That's just a nice way to remember the outline of the book. Now, the section we're looking at here, again, we have that first section, chapters 1 through 35. Those were messages for Israel. Uh, Primarily as they're looking forward to the coming of the Assyrians. There are other things that are mentioned, but they were about to be facing, the northern kingdom was going to be taken into captivity, and indeed it was. And then the southern kingdom likewise would be facing the Assyrians' onslaught. And this is, there would be prophecies in this section, and this is all part of that judgment theme. Notice the last half of the book, chapters 40 through 66, those are messages for Israel looking ahead, not to Assyria, that's already come and gone by that time, but to Babylon and even to Persia, which is the empire that comes after Babylon. And again, those are prophetic sections. Right now we're in this historical section, so notice the two blocks in the middle. We have on the one side, what we're looking at in this series, in this class, is chapters 36 and 37. This is going to be a historic account of the invasion of the Assyrians as Assyria comes down against the kingdom of Judah. We'll see two other stories in chapters 38 and 39 where Hezekiah is going to be, he's actually going to get a prophecy of his impending death. And then God's going to say, he's going to pray, and then God's going to answer his prayer and then give him 15 more years. And then we're going to see visitors from Babylon in chapter 39, and we'll see that under a separate heading. So as I said, right now the big thing on the market is that you have this great Assyrian empire in the year 721 BC. They had come down and taken the northern kingdom of Israel into captivity. Israel had ceased to exist, and now they're back, this time to take the southern kingdom of Judah, and their intent is to take them into captivity as well. We'll see what takes place in these two chapters. When we're talking about Assyria, we have to remember that we're dealing with the most advanced military machine that was in the world of that day. They had all sorts of weaponry. There were archers, there were slingers, like you see here. There were chariots, and we have inscriptions of all of these, both descriptions and actually pictures that they left on their palaces. They would what's the word for it? They would decorate their palaces with these scenes, these images of siege warfare, and they had perfected siege warfare where they wouldn't just come and surround a city and wait for it to finally surrender. They would actually break through the walls of the city, and they had workers and engineers that were very astute about bringing such things to pass. Once they captured a city that had held out and a city that had not surrendered, the Assyrians were masters of all sorts of torture methods. And again, they depict these various methods of torture on the walls of their palaces, saying that nobody else did these sorts of things, hacking off arms and legs and body parts. Notice the illustration on the right. You see a city with the heads of their captives that are ornamenting it. I'm sure that there were other peoples and other cultures that did the same thing, but to the best of our knowledge, nobody nobody decorated their palaces with these sorts of scenes. So because of that, they've gotten an especially violent reputation for this reputation for seeking to bring terror into the hearts of their enemies. And so our passage begins with the Assyrians, chapter 36 and verse 1. Now, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and seized them. He doesn't just come and take one city or lay siege to one city. A number of cities quickly fall to him. Others he surrounds and begins his siege processes. Verse 2, and the king of Assyria sent Rabshakeh. Rabshakeh is like an exalted spokesman. The Rab part is high exalted one. The Rabshakeh from Lachish to Jerusalem to King Hezekiah with a large army, and he stood by the conduit of the upper pool on the highway of the fuller's field. And so here is Sennacherib. He has his headquarters at Lachish. A little bit in a bit, we're going to see where Lachish falls, and he'll move to Libnah. But right now he's at Lachish. We actually can go to Lachish and see the ruins there. And archaeologists have dug up the ruins of Lachish and found the signs of destruction once that city is captured. And while he is there, his envoy, this Rabshakeh, is sent to Jerusalem with a military force, not to capture the city yet. They're going to do this eventually, but to wage a propaganda war. And so the Rabshakeh in chapter 36 comes and delivers his message to Hezekiah. And he says to him, and actually he says this, he speaks in the hearing of all of those that are guarding the wall. Actually, the men of Hezekiah, some of his representatives come and say, oh, why don't you speak to us in Aramaic instead of Hebrew? He says, no, I'm going to speak in Hebrew so that you can all hear what the Assyrian king is going to do against you. And then he, as part of his message, he actually says, God sent me here. This is chapter 36, verse 10. He says, have I now come up without the Lord's approval against this land to destroy it? Yahweh said to me, go up against this land and destroy it. I'm sent by God. Now, I think he's lying. I think he's just making this up, especially when we hear what God has to say about this. And so he says in verse 16, look, don't listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me and come out to me and eat each of his vine and each of his fig tree and drink each of the waters of his own cistern until I come and take you away to a land like your own, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards. I'm going to deport you. So you might as well give up now, survive the deportation, and I will take you away into captivity. Verse 18, beware that Hezekiah does not mislead you, saying the Lord will deliver us. And then he asks what he thinks is a rhetorical question. Has any one of the gods of the nations delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? And then he names some of the gods that are out there. No, my king and our gods are bigger than all of them. That's chapter 36. And so the messengers who hear the message, they come back and they speak to Hezekiah, and they tell him in chapter 37, verse 1, and he tears his clothes, he covers himself with sackcloth, he humbles himself, and he goes to the temple into the presence of the Lord, and he humbles himself before the Lord. This is chapter 37, verses 1 through 4. And while he is doing this, Isaiah comes and gives words of comfort. Says, don't be afraid of the words that you've heard, because what the king there, what this person was doing, this representative of the king of Assyria, he was blaspheming me. And I'm, in verse 7, 37, verse 7, behold, I will put a spirit on him so that he will hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land. I'm going to deliver, God says, through Isaiah. Now, in chapter 37, verse 8, Rabshakeh returns. Again, he goes back, he speaks to the king of Assyria, who's no longer now is in Lachish, but now has moved on to Libnah. And he comes back and gives a second message. It's more or less a repeat of the first, but again saying, look, Assyria is greater than all gods. You have a god, but that's not going to help you. The king of Assyria is bigger than all of that. Nobody can stand up against him. Verse 12, 37:12. Did the gods of those nations, which my fathers have destroyed, deliver them? And then he rattles off some nations that have already fallen to the Assyrians. And the answer is no. Well, Hezekiah goes back again into the temple, and this time we have his prayer before the Lord. And I love his prayer, verse 16, O Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, who is enthroned above the cherubim. Sounds like something out of the Psalms. You are the God, you alone of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see, and listen to all the words of Sennacherib, who sent them to reproach the living God. Listen to what he's saying about you, O Lord, and do something about it. And so he prays to the Lord, and again, Isaiah comes in verse 21 and gives words of, this time they are words of judgment against Assyria. Look specifically down at verse 26, where Isaiah, speaking the words of the Lord, he says, have you not heard? Long ago I did it. From ancient times I planned it. Now I have brought it to pass that you should turn fortified cities into ruinous heaps. God says to the king of Assyria, I have brought you here. You didn't take me by surprise. I know exactly what's going on. Verse 28, I know you're sitting down and you're going out and you're coming in and you're raging against me. Because of your raging against me and because of your arrogance that has come up to my ears, therefore I will put my hook in your nose and my bridle in your lips. That's the sort of things that Assyrians usually did to their enemies. And I will turn you back by the way which you came. And we come to verse 36. We read, then the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men arose early in the morning, behold, all of these were dead. A death plague, I don't know how else to describe it. I'm not saying how God did it. I'm just saying that he comes and suddenly there's a great number that die during the night. And the sun comes up and they don't come up. What's interesting is that the Greek historian Herodotus, and this is his picture that you're seeing, he actually speaks about the Assyrians and some of their conquests, and he talks about a story. Of course, he's living 200 years after the fact, so he's got some of his facts wrong, but he talks about how the Assyrians had come up against Judah and against Jerusalem and against King Hezekiah. He actually tells the story. Now, he's got some of his facts wrong. He says, the way he tells the story, and a plague of field mice, came into the camp of the Assyrians and ate all their bowstrings, and they got up in the morning and they had no weapons because the mice had chewed through all of the things holding their weapons together, and they said, oh, we have no weapons, so they packed up and went home. Nothing about 185,000 Assyrians died. But notice again the points of commonality. Herodotus says, yes, something happened really strange. It's sort of, you could almost call it supernatural. And the Assyrians packed up and went home. Now you say, well, why doesn't he say that 185,000 Assyrians died? Well, perhaps he didn't know. And perhaps he didn't know because the Assyrians never recorded their own defeats. Indeed, we actually have the Assyrian version of this campaign. It's known as the Taylor prism. You're seeing a picture of it, a prism because of the shape. It's a stone that was found in Assyria, and it lists the various campaigns and wars and victories of Sennacherib. And I'm not going to read all of it, but a portion of it comes. He says, as for Hezekiah the Jew, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong walled cities, as well as the small cities in their neighborhood, which were without number, by escalade and bringing up siege engines, we tore them down. Now, you have to understand that as he gets up to this point, he's been talking about, I came to this city and I took all of the captives and the king, and I cut off his head, cut off his arms and legs, and stretched his skin out. And that king, I gouged out his eyes, and I did this to him, and that, and it's with amazing regularity that the Assyrian king describes how he had mistreated and killed and maimed and crucified or impaled all these different kings who stood up to him. And he comes to Hezekiah, and he says, I took a bunch of his cities. And then he says, himself, like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. You say, wait a minute. There's something wrong here. You said that this king and that king and the other king, you gouged out their eyes and you stripped off their skin and you cut off their arms and legs and their head and mounted it on their walls. And Hezekiah, you surrounded him. What's wrong with that picture? And remember, the Assyrians never talked about their defeats. In fact, that hasn't changed in a whole lot of years. I remember back during the Second Gulf War when United Nations forces were at war with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, same area. And Paula and I were actually sitting in front of the television watching the live news broadcasts, as they had embedded reporters, both with the forces, but they also had reporters that were there on the ground in Baghdad, in Iraq. And their version of the Rabshakeh, the Ministry of, I'm going to just call him Ministry of Propaganda. I don't know what his actual title was, but he was there in front of the camera, standing out on the streets of Baghdad, and he's saying, we have won the war against those people from the United Nations. The Americans, they're all dead in the desert. We have won. We are victorious. And all of a sudden, you hear somebody in the background say, hey, what's that? And all of a sudden, the camera just swings over to the right, and down the street, you can see American tanks coming into the city, very much alive. And then you can hear the Minister of Propaganda, their version of Rabshakeh, says, don't look at that, look at me. I tell you, the Americans all died in the desert. Because even today, they do not talk about their defeats. Some things haven't changed in 3,000 years. Well, they didn't talk about their defeats, but they packed up and left and did not return. Indeed, Isaiah chapter 37, continuing in verse 37, so Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. It came about as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god. And this didn't happen immediately, but it happened a number of years later when he was back home after many of his other adventures and battles and things like that. He was in the house of Nisroch, his god, that Adramelech and Sharezer, his sons, killed him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Ararat, and Esarhaddon, his son, became king in his place. And history records that happening as well. That God got the last laugh, and God rescued and redeemed his people, and this king who had blasphemed God was murdered by his own sons.